We've seen that the claim that Jesus rose from the dead wasn't a legend that built up later, or a story borrowed from pagan myths. It goes right back to his first followers. So they're the people that we need to investigate. They claimed that they'd seen him alive again after his death, and that his tomb was empty. But is it possible that they were lying, that it was a massive hoax?
They had a lot to suffer and a huge cost to pay for actually propagating this idea of a resurrected Christ. Many of the disciples went on to die gruesome deaths, proclaiming that Jesus had actually been risen from the dead. So why would they do it? They didn't make financial gain from it. They didn't appear to make much progress in their own lifetime from this idea.
Anyone hearing this claim, if they could have gone and produced the body, or could have gone and shown that the tomb was not as it was described in the stories, then game over. But the game wasn't over, and the authorities were astonished that actually this movement grew and spread, because they weren't making it up. It wasn't a hoax. They wouldn't in any case have made up such an extraordinary story in order then to go and get themselves killed as well. But somehow, because Jesus had been raised from the dead, they had the courage to face mobs, to face execution, to face persecution, torture and death, because they knew that Jesus had gone through death and out the other side into a new bodily life.
The fact that his followers were willing to suffer continuously and willing to give their lives for their proclamation of the gospel shows that they sincerely regarded their beliefs, what they were preaching, as being true. Now, you could accuse them of having psychological problems, perhaps, of hallucinating or being delusional, but to make up the story seems to be very unlikely.
Actually, the idea that the disciples could have been lying and then were later willing to die, it has rarely appeared in the skeptical literature for the last 200 years. And I think we know that if this theory or others don't appear in the literature for 200 years, there's probably a really good reason, and there is. It's a really lame attempt to explain away the resurrection. We are familiar in our society with a lot of people who are willing to die for their message. And I don't doubt for a moment that it's not just Christian missionaries. It could be missionaries in any other religion. It could be the Buddhist priests who set themselves on fire to protest the war in Vietnam decades ago. It could be kamikaze pilots or atheists who die for communism. I mean, I don't doubt that there are a lot of religious and or political causes for which people would die. The point is that when someone willingly dies, that tells you they're sincere. When someone willingly dies, that shows you they believe the message that they are teaching. In the history of religions, no other founder of a major world religion is believed by his or her orthodox followers to have been raised from the dead. None of them, the followers, even say that. The disciples of Jesus are the only ones then, of all the major religions, all the major founders, they're the only one who claim to have evidence of resurrection appearances. Now, what does willing to die for your faith show? It indicates that you are being, to the best of your ability, you believe this, so you're being accurate, you think you're speaking truly. But only the disciples would have evidence for the resurrection. So when a Christian missionary willingly dies, they're dying for the apostles' message of 2,000 years ago. When other religious people die, they're dying for their message whenever that came about. But the apostles, when they were willing to die, the reasoning goes like this: the resurrection is a central Christian message. Without the resurrection, there's no Christian message. So if they died, they had to be dying for the resurrection appearance. Okay, that doesn't prove they're right, but it proves that they believe they were right. But here's the key. They were the only ones who were in the right time, right place, being able to grab the right kind of evidence. They're the only ones who can answer the question, and they're the ones who willingly died.
People have often wondered about alternative explanations for why the early Christian movement happened. And I find there are many theories, either the swoon theory, which we've just dealt with, or the theory that they went to the wrong tomb, or the theory that they decided to make up these stories, or whatever. And all of these simply fail the test of ancient history. That if you study those Jewish movements, and I would urge anyone watching this who's interested to read Josephus, who was the great Jewish historian who was a younger contemporary of St. Paul, and who spent his retirement in Rome writing up the story of the Jewish people in great detail, particularly the events of the first century. And you see in Josephus these revolutionary movements come and go. And you see Simeon ben Kozibar in the generation after Josephus, if you read on in the Jewish history. But you see also the leaders and the would-be messiahs of the era of the Jewish war from 66 to 70, when the Romans came into Palestine to crush the Jewish rebellion and did it very successfully. The leader there was a man called Simon bar Giora, or one of the leaders, and he was the one who many Jews saw as the king, as the Messiah. Indeed, he appeared in royal robes in the temple when the Romans came to capture him. And then they took him off to Rome, and then they did what the Romans always did. They had a huge triumphal procession all the way down the Forum, with Simon right at the back, being beaten and flogged on the way to then his execution. That was what the Romans did. Now, if you imagine, even a little bit of historical imagination, some of Simon's followers who'd managed somehow to escape the same fate, though many of them would be sold as slaves or whatever, supposing a day, a week, a year later, some of them had said, why don't we say that he's been raised from the dead, and then we can start this movement again. And actually, if you know anything about first century Judaism, that's just not what they would have said. Some might have said his cause continues. Some might have said God has put him in a place of honor and he will be raised from the dead. They wouldn't say he has been raised from the dead, because they knew that was absurd. The early Christians would have known that was absurd.
Again, the idea that the disciples stole the body and created the hoax has been flirted with by various people. And at the time, we read in one of the gospel accounts that the Jewish authorities came up with this idea that the body had been stolen. Well, I think there are a number of questions I would want to ask of that hypothesis. The first is, what would the motivation for that be? There wasn't an idea of an individual rising from the dead. The idea of resurrection was a physical and bodily idea within Jewish thought. It wasn't a spiritual resurrection, but it was the idea of a corporate resurrection, not an individual. So we have to ask, where did the idea come from? And scholars just can't see where this idea would have come from. How would the disciples have come up with this, and what possible motivation would they have?
Jesus' first followers truly believed that they'd encountered him alive again after his death. They were ready to die for this belief. And this wasn't what someone else had told them. It was based on their own first-hand experience. So it couldn't have been a hoax. Next time we'll ask whether they could have been sincere in this belief, but deluded. Could the appearances of Jesus have been hallucinations?